Hello, students. Welcome to a lecture on music before 1950 in the United States. This lecture is going to set us up for rock and roll and the emergence of rock and roll in the 1950s. I want to just step through a few things here in Canvas. The first thing that I have open is the genres table right here, so you might want to consider opening that. I'm going to use that to step through the genres that are around before rock and roll. And then I've got all these materials open, these resources for the pre-50s module. You may want to follow along with. I have them open here. I'm just going to start through them. Over here on the right, I have a diagram. I'm going to be drawing the different genres and artists on this according to their time. We're going to have the 1800s in one section here, and then we have each decade of the 1900s before 1950 across the top. On the left here, you'll see I have a rural and an urban section. We're going to be talking about music, how it moves from rural to urban. That's one of the meta themes we've been talking about or looking at already in this class, and I want to just map out some of the genres and artists on that framework for you. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to open is the genres table. You've seen this previously. I want to talk about these 10 or so genres that came out before rock and roll. The first popular American music came out in the minstrel shows. These started as early as in the 1830s, and these were mainly a rural phenomenon where traveling musicians would go around to rural cities and towns and perform songs and acts for audiences. These minstrel shows became wildly popular and became the first truly American popular music style. Unfortunately, these minstrel shows were seated very deeply in racism, and the idea of them was that it was white Americans wanting to witness and observe black America. And at this time, slavery was still legal. In much of the South, African Americans were enslaved. White Americans wanted to be okay with that and wanted to help justify that, and these minstrel shows were one of the ways they did it. If you want to read more on this, feel free. It's pretty disturbing when you look through it. For me, very hard to read, and I'm sure for many of you as well. But the idea is that the white artist would dress up in blackface, paint their face black, and they would act like a caricature of a black person. And usually the idea was to make it that slavery was okay because black people actually wanted to be enslaved. You can read about that more here, just in Wikipedia. It's got a lot of information, and I think you'll probably find it as disturbing as I do. Now, out of that minstrel music emerges something new, because in the late 1800s, we start to be able to develop architecture that can house larger and larger audiences. And what happens, instead of having these travel minstrel shows, by the end of the 1800s, we are able to build theaters and halls in which shows can be performed. And this gives rise to vaudeville. Vaudeville takes its root from minstrel, and it still is very much performed in blackface. Blackface is the dominant art form in the United States from 1830 all the way until about 1920. Vaudeville began to combine in some other ideas besides just the music. They would have circus acts, magic shows, theater, plays, as well as musical performances. After minstrel, vaudeville became the dominant form of American popular entertainment from the late 1800s all the way again to 1920 or so. At the same time, in a more urban level, we have the development of the new concert halls and symphony halls happening in Boston and New York and other cities, where we start to have classical music becoming available to more everyday Americans. Obviously, getting a ticket to a classical music show even back then was pricey, so it's not like everyone got to see that. Most people probably would have gone to a vaudeville show at that time. Another interesting influence that's happening at the same time is the military. And the military bands are starting to get outfitted with new musical instruments that can play more notes, such as the valved trumpet and many of the brass and woodwind instruments that hadn't really existed 100 years previously. These marching bands began to become more popular as we have parades and a sense of national identity that's emerging in the late 1800s. People become more familiar with the military-type songs. Philip Sousa is one of the most famous composers at that time, and there are a lot of military influences coming into music. As these three dominant influences come onto the scene in the early 1900s, we see the emergence of a more commercialized approach to music that starts around 1900. The idea is that people want to make money off of their music or other people's music. This starts the idea of Tin Pan Alley. Tin Pan Alley is very important to the development of popular music in America. The idea of Tin Pan Alley is, by 1900, we don't have a way of recording music yet. We still can't record music. The only way we can share music is either to attend a musical event or get the sheet music for it. And so Tin Pan Alley, the idea of Tin Pan Alley is they started producing sheet music, and they would hire a bunch of songwriters to write out the musical notes, and then they would sell the sheet music just like a book. This developed the idea of there being a publisher and a songwriter, and the music then would be sold to artists who would play it. That artist might be someone famous, or that artist might be your grandmother with her slightly out of tune piano in the living room. So Tin Pan Alley is really our first commercialization of music in the United States, and the idea is that we're sending out published print music. From Tin Pan Alley, one of the important genres that comes out is called ragtime. Now, ragtime has a lot of influence from these existing genres. One influence is vaudeville. The vaudevillian shows became somewhat bawdry. In fact, there was a lot of sexual innuendo and that sort of thing, and people were drinking a lot at the time. In fact, in 1920, we're going to run into Prohibition because there's such heavy drinking at the time. Ragtime became really the first party music sometime around 1890 to 1900. It also had a lot of bounciness and hop march sound to it in order to be danceable. So it had some of the influence from the military marches, the military marching music in it, with a strong emphasis on the beat. And then it also drew on some of the classical song structures and forms and melodies. Okay, so ragtime is really going to emerge out of these three genres here. It's going to be built out of the Tin Pan Alley segment, where the famous writers are going to be publishing their music to be played in bars and speakeasies across the country. The most famous artist in there was Scott Joplin. And you need to know Scott Joplin. You probably already do. If you hear his song called The Entertainer, you probably have heard the ice cream truck playing that song many times. That is ragtime music. It is played on a piano. Ragtime is often not very complex music in terms of its instrumentation, because the idea is that anyone could play it around the country. Some of the pitches in the playing can be difficult, so it's complex on that level, but for the most part, the instrumentation is very simple. So we have a simple form of music. Ragtime becomes the first commercially manufactured popular music in the United States in the 1900s. Simultaneously, out in the rural parts of the United States, especially in Black America and in former slaves who are now freed but still living in the South for the most part, we have the emergence of the blues. Much of the early blues music, we have no way of seeing or hearing it because the artist didn't know how to write music, and there was no way to record music still. It was still around 1900, so there was no record players or anything like that. Early blues came from the fields and the rural areas of the southern United States. Simultaneously, folk music is coming out in rural Appalachia, and if blues is African American, folk music is Caucasian American, meaning white people played folk, black people played the blues. One of the other meta themes we've talked about is the development of classical and simple music into more complex music, and that's exactly what happens with ragtime. Between 1900 and 1920, ragtime will get more and more complex. It will start to have some influence from other genres such as the blues. It's going to continue to have influence from these three genres up above, and we're going to have the emergence of what is called jazz music. And jazz is going to be the dominant art form in American music from 1920 until rock and roll, until 1950 or 1955. Jazz is a combination of these different influences, especially ragtime, classical, military, vaudeville, and the blues. It's going to have a lot of the instrumentation from classical music. It's going to have a lot of the bounciness from military music. It's going to have the bawdriness and party feel of vaudeville music, but it's also going to have a strong African-American influence from the blues. Now, one of the interesting things about white America's fascination with black America is that it has given a path for black Americans to be able to be successful in the music industry in ways they weren't in other industries. It became expected that African Americans or people dressed as African Americans would be the main performers in minstrel music and vaudeville. This made it easy for Americans to accept a black artist such as Louis Armstrong, who is probably the father of jazz in many ways, to become one of the dominant musical artists of the entire 20th century. And Louis Armstrong's career will span from 1917 or so until the mid-1970s when he passes away. In the urban setting, classical music continues, and classical music eventually gives rise to the idea of a musical. And a musical is a combination of a story acted out with music placed in it. It's similar to an opera. The difference is in opera, everyone sings the whole time. In a musical, there is a script and dialogue that happens in between the songs. And musicals become popular, and they are played in these venues and halls that were set up for vaudeville, one of the most important being Broadway. And Broadway is where some of the most early musicals are formed. Tin Pan Alley artists are writing the music in New York, and they developed the idea of Broadway. And then in the 1920s, we get movies. And for the first time, we can start to put sound to movies by the end of the 1920s, 1927, 28. And the birth of the musical happens. And the musicals become a very dominant genre from 1920 all the way up even until 1960. We'll hear some popular ones. So musicals are an important genre in this time period from 1920 until the birth of rock and roll. More rurally, folk music starts to give rise to the idea of country western. And country western originally, and in fact I'll start with that here, was called hillbilly music. This was probably not a positive term at the time. It was probably derogatory and racist towards the people who sang hillbilly music because they would have been fairly uneducated rural white Americans. More changes happened in the 1920s than probably any other decade. A couple of the important ones were the women's right to vote, the prohibition of alcohol, and the beginning of the Great Migration, which means African Americans living in the southern United States start moving to the cities. This is because there was the invention of the automobile and the tractor in the 1910s and 1920s that made it so you didn't need people to work on the farms. You could do it with a machine. So these African Americans began to bring their blues ideals into the cities, and these influences really allow jazz to explode. On top of all that, in 1920, we have the invention of the radio, and the radio allows jazz to be spread across the United States. Everyone can hear it. In fact, probably the invention of the radio is the most important part to the idea of singular music genres being popular across the United States, because now we can listen to these different genres no matter where we live, whether we're in Oklahoma, whether we're in New York, whether we're in California. Like any other genres, jazz continues to get more complex. If it was more simple in ragtime, it becomes more complex when it becomes jazz. By the 1930s, we get the emergence of what's called big band. Big band music means that there are 40 to 50 musicians playing at once in a huge group, and it becomes the party music of the 1930s and 1940s. Big band is a counterpoint in some ways to the Great Depression of the 1930s and World War II in the 1940s. It's the one place where Americans can cut themselves free for a little bit. As World War II continues and many men are sent overseas, many of them not to return, music starts to become more focused on a female audience. And we get the idea of the crooners. And the crooner music is music that is soft, slow, and ballad-like. Part of this is the development of the microphone technology that allows singers to sing very quietly and smoothly. We had never had that before. There was no way to listen to somebody singing smoothly because in this period, in order to be recorded, you had to play the music very loud. You had to make a mechanical needle move on a record, which was very difficult. As African Americans move from the country into the city, they take with them their blues roots. And for those who couldn't or weren't interested in playing jazz in the more traditionally white clubs, there became the emergence of a urban African American culture. It was originally called race music, and race music became renamed rhythm and blues in the 30s and 40s. And rhythm and blues is going to be one of the most influential genres on rock and roll. Similarly, hillbilly music becomes country music. As we approach the birth of rock and roll in the 1950s, these genres, country, rhythm and blues, jazz in the form of big band, and crooner popular music, have the greatest influence on the development of rock and roll. And next week we're going to look at how those led to